Hey guys, welcome back, and yes, as you can see, we are back in the garage for yet another bike build. Now this one is going to be a bit of an interesting one because this is going to be the first bike build I've ever done that uses hydraulic disc brakes. Now, I've never messed around with hydraulics before, so this could go horribly wrong, but it would be a good learning exercise all the same. Also, this will be the first time that I'm using a budget Chinese Groupset by L2. And the Groupset specifically I'm using on this build is their R9 2x11 speed. Now, the first thing to mention about this is that when it arrived, this is the box that it came in, which I was aware of, so I'm not going to complain about. It was actually cheaper to buy it without the box than it was to be shipped like this. I assume because the box is much larger, takes up more space on the ship or the plane, however it's brought over from China, and so therefore L2 can send it to you for a cheaper price if it isn't in the original box. However, despite the fact that this looks like just a load of jumbled parts, it is actually very well packed, and I've already taken a few of these bubble plastic bags out, so it was very well protected. It is all very well looked after in there, so I have no doubt that it is all going to work perfectly, but just be aware that if you do buy it without the box, this is how it's going to come. Now, this frame is going to be a gravel bike that I'm building up for my son. I'm using this Dolan GXA frame, which I recently bought on eBay for 200 quid. Now, it is a beautiful looking frame. It's got the odd usage marks on it here, especially back on the rear chainstay, where the previous owner obviously had quite a bit of chain slap, and then there's some marks up around the head tube at the front here where cables have been rubbing. But otherwise, it is an absolutely beautiful frame and very light. Although it is an aluminium frame, it does have a carbon fibre fork, and it actually feels lighter, just the bare frame, than the full carbon fibre road bike that I built for my son a couple of weeks ago. So it'll be interesting to see, once this is fully built up, just how much it weighs. Now, I assume that it will weigh a little bit more than the carbon fibre road bike. One, because this is aluminium frame, although it does have the carbon fibre fork, the rest of the body is aluminium. And two, as I say, it's going to be hydraulic disc brakes, whereas the road bike is mechanical rim brakes, which tend to be lighter than disc brake bikes. Anyway, now just to take you through the frame a little bit, as you can see, I've already put the stem and the handlebars on because I've been over those things a number of times in previous build videos, so I didn't see the point in rehashing all that again. And also, it just helps me to keep the fork in. The bike does have a fairly unusual semi-internally routed cable system. Now, as you can see here, I've already put, for the front and rear derailleurs, I've put these cable guides in already to help me push the cables through. However, as you can see, the cables go into the top of the down tube here, and then they come out of this very mysterious looking aperture at the bottom of the down tube, just below the bottom bracket. Now, it's a little bit strange. I've not seen that on a bike before, but I actually quite like it because it gives all of the aesthetic of being internally routed up the front, so it keeps the cockpit nice and clean. But at the back, you don't have all the trouble of trying to route those cables around the bottom bracket and along the chainstay and trying to feed it out of a tiny aperture at the back of the chainstay. That can be an absolute nightmare. So I'm quite happy with this fairly unusual setup. I'm calling it a fairly unusual setup because I've never seen it before. I'm sure you'll tell me in the comments if this is a fairly common thing on other bikes. But in any case, I quite like it, and hopefully it should make my job of cabling a lot easier. The other thing is that I noticed is that inside of the down tube was this rubber tubing, which I'm going to presume is to run the cable housing, or should I say the hydraulic hose for the rear brake, to stop it slapping around inside of the frame as you're moving. So that should dampen the noise somewhat, so that's quite nice. I will feed that back in as I'm running the hoses through. So just before I start getting on with the build and going back to the weight very briefly, just to let you know, I did weigh this earlier today, just the bare frame and then the forks on their own. The frame comes in at just over 1.6 kilos and the fork at just 440 grams, which is incredibly light. Again, I know it's carbon fibre, but even for a carbon fibre fork, considering that it is a fairly wide fork to accommodate a wider gravel wheel, that is very, very light. So the whole frame weighs in at just over 2 kilos, which I think is incredible. Now, the important thing to note is that this is a 49 centimetre frame, which will account for the fact that it is a lot lighter. A larger frame will invariably be a little bit heavier. But as I say, this is for my son. He's just under 5 foot tall at the moment, so this should fit him perfectly. Having said that, I did say that about the road bike that I built him, and then that still, at the moment, is too big for him to ride. I think that might be about a 51 centimetre frame though, so that might be why it's just a little bit too big for him at the moment. But I'm hoping that a 49 centimetre frame should be just perfect for him. But we will see once it's built. But with all that said, let's get on with the build. And the first thing I'm going to do, unusually, is to get the shifters on and then run the hydraulic hoses. I want to get that job out of the way first and foremost because, as I say, I've never done that before. And once that job's done, then the rest of it should be fairly simple. And I'm hoping I won't have too many more problems after that. So let's get the shifters on. Okay, well, the first problem I've come across, which is fairly frustrating, is that the screw to tighten up the shifter onto the bars is, on most shifters, is off out to the side here. So you can stick your screwdriver or your tool into the side and the hood doesn't get in the way. However, on this one, the screw seems to be right on top behind the hood. So because the hood itself is difficult to pull back, it's then difficult to get a screwdriver in there. And even when you do get it in there, you're sort of at an odd angle trying to keep the stem of the screwdriver out of the way of the hood, or at least the hood out of the way of the stem of the screwdriver. So that's a problem I'm going to have to overcome first and foremost. But yeah, just a little bit of a frustration. It would be nice if the screw was out to the side like many other shifters I've tried before, because that would then make it a hell of a lot easier to actually get this thing tightened up. Oh well, let's keep trying. Right, I've had to take the shifter off and use all my might to pull the hood back to get the screwdriver into the hole. Now I'm going to have to try and keep the screwdriver in there while I thread all this back on to the handlebar, and then hopefully I can get it tightened up. This is not what I needed at the very beginning of this job. Okay, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. Before I get too far, I'm going to try and get the other side on as well and just get them fairly tight so they're not just dropping straight off the bars. And then once I've got that done, I'm going to put the wheels on and drop the bike down so it's flat on the floor, so I can get the handlebars in the correct position from the very start and then get the hoods in the correct position as well. Because what I don't want, I'm finding now, is to get these tightened up and then find that I need to untighten them later to play around with them and get them in the right position. I only want to do this job once. However, I do know from the few videos I've watched about installing brake hoses is that you do need a little bit of manoeuvrability with these shifters to slide the hose into the back of the port at the back of the shifter. So this might not work how I want it, but I'll get the bike down with the wheels on, get the handlebars and the shifters sort of in place with a little bit of wiggle room, and then we'll go from there. But yeah, this is slightly frustrating for the first job. I feel that I've fallen at the first hurdle here, but I will not be defeated. Okay, so that is the shifters on, and as I said earlier, there is still a little bit of a wiggle with them, so there is room to move them around. So I think what I'm going to do next is actually run the hoses up through the frame and then out and secure them into the back of the shifters. Because as I mentioned earlier, on the videos that I've watched, you do need a little bit of movement in these shifters to get the cable in properly and tightened up so that the fit is secure and watertight. So I'm going to leave the shifters as they are for the moment, and I'm going to run the hoses. Now, handily, these brake calipers come with the hose already terminated into the caliper. I don't know whether these cables come pre-installed with fluid. I'm assuming they do, because otherwise why would they terminate the hose into the caliper? But we'll find out when I get to bleed them, I guess. But to seal the end off, they've actually put this little like silver eyelet in the end. And so what you can do with that is threadle through an old shift cable, this is, and use that to help you fish the hose through the frame. Now the only problem with this is that with the way that this frame is set up, as I mentioned earlier, with this large aperture just under the bottom bracket, I would actually much prefer to push the hose in this end, and then it should be fairly easy to fish it out of the bottom here. Unfortunately, as I say, the caliper is on this end and the caliper needs to be at this end of the bike, so I'm going to have to push it up backwards through this aperture and then out of the very small hole at the top of the down tube here. And that means I will have to employ the services of my handy mounting tool here, which is effectively a large magnet that I can attach to this cable to pull it through and then pull the rest of the hose through. So I'm now going to get on with that, and hopefully that job will be a lot easier than getting these shifters on. But once, as I say, once these hoses are in, I can then start getting them terminated into the shifters and then get the shifters and the handlebars in the correct position. And then that's actually the hardest part of the job done. So let's get on with that now, see how we get on. Right, actually, change of plan. I have just realised that I have some more of this cable guide tube left over, and I think what I can do with this is pass this down through the tube and take it out through this large aperture at the bottom. I should then be able to thread the shift cable through this up and out of the top of the down tube and then pull the whole lot through. I'm thinking that might work because, as I said earlier, it would be much easier to thread the cable or any cable through down from the top of the down tube out of the hole at the bottom bracket. So I'm going to give that a go first, see how that works out. Right, well, wonders never cease. That has actually come out nice and easily. So I'm thinking now that if I thread this rubber tubing across the cable guide that I've just put in, I should then be able to pull the whole shift cable plus the hose through this up and out the top of the down tube. I'm trying to second guess myself here because I don't know. I'm trying to figure out if this is actually going to work, but I guess the only way to find out is to do it. So wish me luck. Let's give this a go. So I'm going to feed the shift cable through the rubber hose, down over the hydraulic hose, push that shift cable up through here. So now that I've got that shift cable through there, I can remove this plastic guide, and that is pulling the brake hose through. By George, I think this is working. Right, I'm going to have to push the rubber hose up through because that aperture, or it's just a little bit smaller than the brake hose with the rubber hosing over the top of it. So it's being a bit of a pig to go through. But the hose is coming out. I don't believe it. It's actually worked. It has worked. That is the rear brake hose through, and I should just explain that I have brought that out the right side of the down tube here, so it wraps around the head tube and goes into the left-hand shifter, because in the UK we use the left brake for the rear and the right brake for the front. So as I say, the hose has come out of the right side of the top tube and then will come around the front of the head tube and then into the shifter. And then in the fork here, there's another aperture for the front brake hose to go down in, which will come around this side of the head tube and then into the right shifter. So I'm very happy that that has gone quite so well. So the rubber tube is installed inside, which is good. So that should stop the hose flapping around inside and knocking against the frame as we're riding. So we can get rid of this shift cable now, and I will loosely install the caliper onto the rear chainstay with the provided gubbins that you get with both of the calipers. Now L2 do send all the little bits and pieces to set the front and rear brakes up for either 140 or 160 mil brake rotors. I've gone for 140mm rotors on this because Rayon's not going to need a huge amount of braking power, or at least 140mm is going to give him more than enough braking power. As I say, it's only a very light bike. He's only very light himself, so he's not going to need a huge amount of braking power for a really heavy bike or a really heavy rider. So 140mm rotors I'll be using, so I can get rid of the two attachments that have 160mm written on them. Very handily, they do mark which one is the front and which one is the rear and what size they are both used for, so you know at a glance exactly which ones you need to use, so that is very helpful. And now I can go about attaching the rear brake caliper to the chainstay. Right, well that's the rear brake caliper on, and as I've mentioned in previous videos, you want to leave it a little bit loose so that when you put the wheel in, and once everything has been bled and all the brakes are ready to go, I can then squeeze and hold on to the brake while tightening the mount up. That will then perfectly centralise the brake caliper with the brake disc. So leaving that loose for the moment. So now the next job to do is run the much shorter front brake hose up through the fork and up to the shifter. And there you go, that job is much simpler to do on the fork than it is for the rear brake on the down tube. There we go, swings and roundabouts. Okay, and that's the front brake hose done. And again, I've left that loose to be able to centralise the brake caliper with the disc later. Okay, so now that's done, comes the scary bit, because at this point I need to measure how long I need the hoses to be and then cut them. So this is the point where I'm going to put the wheels on, drop the bike down and get everything as level and in position as I can, measure the hoses, get them cut, and then try and terminate them into the back of the shifters. Yeah, this is the bit I'm not looking forward to, but with every new job must come the first try. So it's time to be brave, put my big boy pants on and get on with it. Okay, so that is the wheels on, and I will go through in a moment exactly what these wheels are and where I got them from and how much I paid for them. But for now, let's stick with the job at hand to get the bike off of the work stand and get these handlebars straightened out. Right, yeah, now it's down. I can see that the handlebars are very much tilted upwards. So let's rectify that now, and hopefully we won't have to play around with them again afterwards. Okay, that looks pretty good for the drops now. They look fairly flat to the ground. And so now I just need to adjust the position of these hoods. Now that right hand one looks like it might be in a pretty good position already, and this left hand one might need to come up a little bit, but otherwise they're not far off. So this is the point where I grab, of course, my AliExpress hose cutting tool, which as you can see has had a lot of use since I bought it. This is literally the first time I've even got it out of the packet. I've not even looked how to use it, so this could be a little bit of a baptism of fire. I'll just show you a little bit of a close-up of this first of all, just to give you an idea of exactly what this is. Now, again, I have never used one of these before, so I don't know if this thing is going to differ massively from bigger name options like Park Tool, for instance. But this screw part here, I would assume, is where you clamp your hose into to make sure it doesn't move, and then you put the barb into the top of the hose and then use this screw to push the barb down into the aperture, and this is obviously to cut the hose to give you a nice clean cut. That looks like a nice sharp razor. So let's see how this works. But it also comes with another pin head here, which looks ever so slightly thicker than the one that's on there. So as I say, I don't know for certain, but I'm going to assume that these are for the different types of hoses that you can buy. There are a number of different hoses. I believe there's about 4 or 5 different types, but the two main ones are BH59 and BH90, and I think I'm right in saying that BH59 has a larger aperture, which I believe is the hose that L2 use with this group set. But yeah, otherwise this looks fairly simple to use, and hopefully it shouldn't give me too many problems. Actually, having said all that, I think maybe my eyes were deceiving me, because now I take a closer look at these two pointed ends, they look pretty much the same size. So maybe these parts are universal, and that a BH90 and a BH59 barb can be pushed in with either one of them. Right, okay, well, I'm going to try and cut the front brake first of all. This one is going to be a little bit more forgiving because the fork obviously moves with the handlebars, and so this one doesn't really matter too much how short it's cut, because it's not going to ever be caught around the head tube here, and so that isn't going to stop it from moving at any point. So all I need to really make sure is that I've got a nice loop in the hose here, and then feed it in to the back of the shifter. Okay, that looks pretty good, so here goes nothing. And this is where I find out whether these are pre-filled with oil, because I assume that if it is, I'm going to get some oil cascading out here. So let's get some tissue ready to catch any oil that comes out. And yes, there is oil in there. Okay, so the next thing we do is get our barb, and then as I mentioned earlier, we need to clamp our hose. We screw this down to push the barb in place. There you go, that looks pretty good. And so there we have one fully installed barb. Yeah, and so I'm pretty happy with that. So now I need to get the olive and our screw piece. Place the screw piece over first, then our olive, and then we run our cable, push our cable into place, make sure it's pushed all the way home. And this is why I said that the shifters need to have a little bit of movement in them, because I've had to pull this shifter all the way to the side so I can get this threaded nut in without cross-threading it. Right, so there we go, that is in there tight. So now effectively what we've got is a hard end that our hose is pushing into, then we have the olive which sits around the hose, and then a screw piece which, as we screw it in, the olive will compress and deform and it will squeeze the hose pipe. Now, I know this much because I used to do a bit of plumbing in a previous life, and you used to use olives for compression fittings on copper pipework as well. So I know exactly how this works. Although I've never done hydraulics before, I do understand olives. So as I say, as you screw that bolt in, it will compress the olive, which will cause it to deform and squeeze tight down on the hose, which will give a nice tight seal. That's the idea anyway, so let's get this tightened up and we will see in due course if I have made a tight enough seal or if it's going to leak air, but hopefully, fingers crossed, it won't. Right, I think that is the front brake done. That feels pretty good. It is braking with the wheel in there, but there is quite a lot of throw on the brake lever, so that's understandable because there is probably air inside the system at the moment which I need to bleed out and fill up the hose with mineral oil, so that's fine. But that seems to be working pretty well at the moment. So now we move on to the rear brake. Now, unlike the front brake, as I mentioned earlier, this is the one that we need to be a little bit careful of, because if I cut this too short, if you turn the handlebars too sharply, it will foul against the head tube here. So we need to leave a certain amount of hose to make sure that doesn't happen, but that looks pretty good, and that isn't an excessive amount of hose there. Right, well that is both front and back brakes plumbed in, and again, if I squeeze that rear brake, it engages. It actually has less of a throw than the front one, so that, I imagine, is going to need less bleeding. And that is also a job I'm not looking forward to, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But for now, I'm going to line these hoods up. They do look pretty good as is, actually, so I probably won't move them too much. Maybe I'll lift this one up ever so slightly. But other than that, it looks pretty good. So I'll tighten these up, I'll get the bike back up in the work stand, and then I can start running the cable housings and pushing the cables through for the front and rear derailleur. Let's get it. Right, well actually, now I've got that back up in the stand and I've cut the hoses and terminated them, I feel like that might actually have been the easier part of this job, and that bleeding them is probably going to be a bit of a nightmare later. But who knows, that job might go just as smoothly as terminating the hoses did. So let's wait and see, let's not jinx anything. Right, let's get on with running the cable housing. Right, so actually this bike doesn't need too much gear cable anyway, because all we've got is a little bit running from the back of the shifter here into a pot in the down tube, and then the cable runs naked down the down tube and then out of this aperture at the bottom of the bottom bracket, and again runs naked then up to this part at the back where we then need probably another only 5 to 6 inches of housing. It's the same for the other side as well. Again, we'll only need a small piece coming from the back of the shifter into the down tube, and then immediately where it comes out of the hole at the bottom of the down tube, it will go into the cable routing guide at the bottom and then straight up into the front derailleur. So actually, this is a fairly simple job and should be done pretty quickly. Oh, and in case you're wondering, I'm not actually going to run the rear part of the cabling yet because I've not actually put the rear derailleur on. I'm just going to get the cables in and then start attaching all the other components afterwards, because as I say, I really just wanted to get these brakes done first. But once this is done, then I can start with building the rest of the bike. Right, so all bar the termination of the cables into the front and rear derailleur, that is basically all the cabling done. I'm now going to use some insulation tape to keep all of these hoses and cables in place here. And then I can get on with the bottom bracket, and then I can properly start putting the bike together. Now, before I do my final dreaded job, as I've said many times before, doing the handlebar tape, I will do the bleeding of the brakes because I don't want to risk getting any oil over the new handlebar tape. So I'll get everything on first and leave the bar tape until the end as the sort of pièce de résistance to bring it all together. So let's now get these hoses and cable housings taped up. Okay, well that is the hoses and housings all taped up on the bar, and so now I can actually get on with putting the bike together proper with the front and rear derailleur. Now, the front derailleur for this bike should be a clamp-on. There is no braze-on style bracket here, but the derailleur that comes with the L2 Groupset is a braze-on, so there's a bit of a problem. At least it would be if I hadn't bought this handy dandy little clamp-on adapter. So this clamps on to the seat tube as a normal clamp-on derailleur would, and then the braze-on style front derailleur screws directly onto that. So fear not, if you don't have a frame that doesn't accept a braze-on derailleur, you can buy these little adapters to make it still work. But actually, before any of that, before putting the derailleurs on, I'm going to put the bottom bracket in and the crankset, because I won't know where exactly to set the front derailleur without the crankset being in. Now, I did buy a few weeks ago a GRX crank from, again, John Pye & Sons auction site, which I am a huge fan of. There are some absolutely incredible deals, very cheap deals to be had on there. And I bought this 175mm GRX crankset. It was a GRX 600, and I was going to use that on this bike, and I did actually buy a BB60 which has a 20mm spindle hole, I think it is, which is what the Shimano GRX needs. So I bought all of that and was going to put that on this bike. However, since buying that, I've also bought from John Pye & Sons auction site a set of GRX shifters. Now I'm thinking that I will probably save that GRX crank for another project in the future, possibly another gravel bike for myself. Watch this space. So I needed a crankset for this bike, and again, for the third time in this video, John Pye & Sons came to the rescue, because I found myself this FSA Omega crankset. Now, would you believe this crankset cost me £15, including delivery, and the bottom bracket for it, and I needed the bottom bracket specifically because this is a 19mm spindle, so a special bottom bracket. I think this is a BB 4000 bottom bracket. So all of this together, the crank and the bottom bracket, came to 15 quid delivered. So yes, now I have this full speed ahead Omega crankset, which I'm going to be fitting to the bike. It is a 50-34 tooth, so it is a road bike specific crank really, but I think we can probably still get away with it for a gravel bike, because I am going to be putting an 11-32 cassette on here, so running the 32-34 combination ratio should get us up a few decent hills as well if we need it. So let's get the bottom bracket installed, and then we can go about getting the derailleurs on. Right, so that's the bottom bracket and the drive side of the crank in. Now, interestingly, this non-drive side crank arm has a self-extracting screw. It has like an old Octolink style linkage inside, but then there is a screw with an 8mm hex head. So this essentially just pushes straight on to the opposite side of the crank, and then you use an 8mm hex head just to screw it down. And when you need to take it off, you simply unscrew the 8mm hex head and it self-extracts the crank arm off of the crank. Very, very clever, and negates the need for a specialist crank puller. So yeah, even less tools needed. Lovely, and that is running beautifully smoothly. So now that's on, I can get my front derailleur on. Okay, so we have the shifters on in place, the cable housings and the hoses are run through the frame. The cables for the front and rear derailleur have been run, the front and rear derailleur themselves are on, and the crankset is on, along with the disc brake calipers, the disc brakes on the wheels, and the wheels are installed. Now, I'm giving you that rundown because it is now very late in the evening, and I think I'm going to call it a day because this seems like a pretty good place to stop where I can pick it up in the morning. The only thing left to do in the morning is to bleed the brakes, put the tyres on the wheels, and then put the new seat post in, saddle on, and bar tape. So there are only really a few cosmetic jobs and the bleeding of the brakes to do tomorrow. So I'm feeling very tired. I'm going to leave it here and I will see you in the morning. Right, good morning, we are back. It is a new day and I am feeling fully energised and refreshed. I must admit I was feeling a little bit tired by the time I finished this last night. It was probably close to midnight and yeah, it'd been a long day. I'd been up for quite a while, but now after a good night's sleep I am feeling ready and raring to go and very much looking forward to finishing this build. And I think the first thing that I'm going to get on with is bleeding the brakes to make sure that they are working perfectly. Now, as you've probably guessed, I am no expert at hydraulics and certainly no expert at bleeding brakes, so I am not going to give any sort of instruction on how to do this and the process that I'm going to use to do this, because I am no one to be giving advice on this at the moment. Maybe in a couple of videos time where I've done a few more of these hydraulic builds, but not right now. But what I will do is leave a couple of links below to the Park Tool brake bleeding video that I watched, which was very handy, but also the L2 specific brake bleeding video, because that differs slightly from the Park Tool one. The Park Tool one uses mainly Shimano shifters and calipers, which I now realise are slightly different in their setup to the L2 one. So again, I will leave the L2 specific video below as well. So I'm going to get on with bleeding the brakes now, and I assume I will just put a time lapse in here for you to watch the entire process in quick time. Right, let's get it done. Okay, that is both front and rear brakes done, and I'm very happy with how that's working. Now, I have to say that it was a little bit fiddly, but it wasn't anywhere near as bad as I was expecting it to be, which was quite good. I'm quite happy with that. So I've just put the wheels back on, and while I am talking about the wheels, I will tell you that they are a set of giant SX2 wheels. Now, again, I got these from John Pye & Son Auction House, and the price for both wheels for the entire wheel set was £55. I know I keep going on about it, but there are some crazy prices to be had on that website. So 55 quid for a set of giant SX2 wheels, and honestly, they are absolutely pristine. I think they are brand new. I honestly don't think that they've been used before because they look incredible. They are, however, currently set up for tubeless, as they currently have the tubeless valve sitting in there. I'm not quite ready to run tubeless just yet, certainly not on a bike for my son. I don't want him to have to deal with any issues when he does eventually start going out on his own on his bike. I don't want him to have to start dealing with any sealant issues or anything like that. So I am going to be running tubes. He knows how to repair and change an inner tube, so I'm going to stick with that at the moment. So I'll get these valves removed. I'll keep those for a future project because I will eventually start messing around with tubeless, but I'll take the valves out for now, get some new inner tubes in, and then I will tell you about the tyres that I'm going to be running on this. Right, so tubeless valves out, and we are ready to install the tubes and the new tyres. And this is what I've gone for. Now, it's a Panaracer Gravel King SK Plus. Yes, I know that I use these on my own gravel bike and I moan about them quite a lot, but that's the 43mm version. This is the 38mm version, so slightly narrower. But honestly, he's not going to be doing a lot of road riding on this bike. It's going to be mainly off-road stuff. So these are a little bit draggy, as I've moaned about before, but as I say, he's going to be doing mostly off-road on these, and these are incredible off-road. So I wanted to give him as much grip as possible from as narrow a tyre as possible to try and give him a bit of crossover between road and gravel for when he is on the road very, very shortly before getting to the gravel and the mud. So these, I think, are going to be absolutely perfect. So let's get the wheels off, get the tubes on, and get these installed. Oh boy, right, well, as is expected from the Gravel Kings now, they do take a little bit of getting on, so that put up a bit of a fight, but it is on now, so let's get the valve screwed in, secured, and we can pump it up and put it back on the bike. Not looking forward to doing the front one though. Right, well that one went a little bit easier, but I still had to get the tyre lever involved to persuade it on. Yep, that looks pretty good now. That's all seated nicely. So let's get it on now, and then, yeah, there's no escaping it now, unfortunately. It's the bar tape. Right, that is the bars taped up with my normal trick of using insulation tape back to front, so the sticky side is out, to give a nice bit of adhesive for the bar tape to go onto. And as I've said before, that way you find that it doesn't unroll as easily, and especially if the bar tape ever gets cut, if the bike falls over when you're out on the road, you find that it won't unravel. Now the bar tape that I've gone for is this Ride Race, I don't know which way it is, but again from AliExpress, and it is mostly black with a little bit of flecked red. So I'm going for a bit of a grey and red theme on this bike. I don't now ultimately know whether that will go. I've also got a red saddle, which I'll come on to in a moment. I'm not sure I'm ultimately that keen on a red and grey colour scheme, but it will do for now, and I might end up changing it all around. But it will get the bike done for now and get Rayon out riding it. So let's get the bar tape on. Right, that's one side done, and I have to say that the finishing strips that they often supply with these bar tapes is absolute gash. It just doesn't stick to the bar properly, and it always ends up looking really ugly. So eventually I will take that off and I will exchange it for a piece of black insulation tape, because that sticks like brown stuff to a blanket. But that'll have to do for now. That will keep the bar tape from unravelling anyway. So that's that side done. I'll get the other side done now. Right, bar tape is done, along with the absolutely awful finishing tape there. I will definitely have to change that later. So the only thing left to do now is to put the saddle and the new seat post on, and then I will take you through the entire cost of this whole build. Right, so there we go, one fully completed bike, and I appreciate that the seat post is far too high at the moment, but that's purely so I can hold it in the work stand. So as far as installing the L2 Groupset goes, it wasn't too difficult. Now, as I said at the beginning, I did have a bit of a problem getting these shifters tightened up because the screw is directly behind the hood. But in terms of running the hoses and bleeding the calipers and the shifters, it was fairly straightforward. It did help that there was already mineral oil in the hoses, so that helped a little bit. That cut down a little bit of time and having to push so much oil through the hoses. But otherwise, this was a pretty enjoyable build, and I cannot wait for Rayon to have a look at this. But importantly, I need to take you through how much this cost. So let me get my handy dandy list and we will go through exactly how much I spent on this. So starting with the biggest expense was £200, as I previously mentioned, for the frame, and that was from eBay. Then moving on to the wheels, again they were from John Pye & Sons, and they are a set of giant SX2 wheels. They cost me £55 delivered. Again, absolutely incredible price for a wheel set. The L2 R9 hydraulic group set, that cost 160 quid, and again, just to clarify, that comes with the 2 shifters, the front and rear derailleur, and the 2 brake calipers along with the hoses. So that was £160 from AliExpress. Next up is the cassette, and again I got that from John Pye on another one of their auctions. That was £10. That's a 105 11 to 32 cassette on the back there. The saddle I got from AliExpress again, that was £16, and also from AliExpress was the chain, and that was £15. The tyres were from Amazon because I needed to buy those last minute. Somehow I completely forgot to buy tyres, and so I had to order those a couple of days ago on Amazon Prime to come here quickly. However, they were 2 for £50. They were £24.99 each, so 50 quid for the 2 tyres. They were on an offer on Amazon. So again, I don't think that's too bad for a pair of Gravel King SKs, but 50 quid for those. The handlebars were £17, again from AliExpress. They are a set of aluminium bars, not carbon fibre. I decided to go with aluminium for this build. The bar tape was £6, again from AliExpress. The stem from AliExpress was £10. And the suspension seat post was £12 from AliExpress. And that is a brand called Cochevlo, I don't know how you pronounce it, but again, that was from AliExpress and fairly cheap. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, was the FSA Amiga crankset, which I got for £15 delivered, along with the bottom bracket, not forgetting the bottom bracket, the BB4000 bottom bracket. 15 quid for an FSA crank and bottom bracket. Mind blown. So when you add all of that together, that comes to a grand total of just over £560, which I don't think is a bad price for what is a beautiful gravel bike. Now, if you were to buy this bike brand new, I'm not sure if they still do it, but at the time when it was out, it would have been around £1,500 for this bike fully built. So 560 quid thereabouts, I think, is an absolute bargain price for it. So with all that said, there's only one more thing I need to do, and of course that is weigh the thing, because I know you're all interested. So let's grab it down and grab my luggage scales as ever. Well, that comes in at just a shade over 10 kilograms, 10.15 kilograms, which is not the lightest bike in the world, but again, it is a gravel bike and it needs a little bit of a heft to it so you don't get thrown off on the trails. And it was always going to be a little bit heavier than the road bike I built for Rayon a little while ago, because that was full carbon fibre. It was mechanical rim brakes instead of hydraulic disc brakes. This also, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, has an aluminium handlebar as opposed to a carbon fibre one. So there are a lot more bits on this bike that just add up to that extra weight, but 10 kilos I don't think is a bad weight for a gravel bike. So only one thing remains now, and that is to go and give it to him. So I'm going to take this outside, get a few close-up shots of it for your enjoyment at the end of the video, and yeah, hopefully you'll see this out on another video soon, testing out the L2 group set, seeing how he likes it. But otherwise, thank you very much for tuning in, guys. I hope you enjoyed this build as much as I enjoy putting it together, surprisingly. And yeah, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.